So first things first, you're going to want to create a icosphere. Bump up the little subdivisions a little bit, you know, you gotta add some stuff. Now add this stuff into a folder called Foliage Assets. Doesn't really matter what you name the folder, to be quite honest with you. I just like to keep my stuff organized, so make sure you have it in a collection. This is gonna be really important later on, and you'll see why. Now, next thing you're gonna wanna do is add displacement. Create a new texture, set it to clouds like you normally do for all these things. You always be setting that shit to clouds, you know you do. It's fucking always clouds. No matter what, it's always clouds. You don't use any of the other textures. Never touch them. Just kidding. Touch them. We'll forget that I said anything. This is all depending on your liking, but essentially what we need to get here is a little blob. So you'll see here that the effect is not moving, so we're gonna set it to global. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to move our object, and anytime we move the object, it's going to procedurally displace the object. This is really good if you're trying to kind of create like maybe water droplets using a mesh. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a second layer of displacement. Usually you could use the same exact texture, it doesn't really matter, or you can add a different texture. And for this one, this is going to be our wind control. Because, you know, I gotta give a little bit of extra ability to this, because what if I want wind blowing on the leaves? Who knows? So to do this, essentially what you're gonna need to do is create an empty object. This can be anything. We're gonna name it wind controller, obviously, because that's what the fucking thing is, and obviously it's not fucking doing anything here. It's not doing anything. So change the coordinate system from local to object. So pick select your object to the empty, and now anytime you move the empty, it will actually displace your rock. You can scale it up, it'll actually change the scale of your displacement and everything like that, so you can really get some variation in the control with the wind. But now we're going to create some duplicates of the sphere, and this is why I like having the coordinate system set up as global, because now if I just move it over a little bit, it's a whole different blob shape, and from there we can scale it up, rotate it, go into edit mode, do a lot of these like weird things. It doesn't really matter. Scale down doesn't matter, but essentially we just need like 4 to 5, even more if you wanted to, blobs. Now turn off those layers. You don't need them. You don't need the layers anymore. What you're gonna need to do now is add a icosphere and bring out a new window. This new window is going to be where you put in your geometry nodes. Rename the icosphere Ghibli trees. Rename it something pretty. It's the tree. It's essentially your geonodes object. So I started out with an icosphere with a really low subdivision because I didn't really need something big right away. We could subdivide this later. It doesn't really matter. So don't get your panties in twists. Add join geometry. The reason why we want join geometry here is just so we can see the icosphere underneath. I did this in advance. We're gonna drag the collection from the top and drag it. Let's add a distribute points on faces, and then also add in a instance on points. To be fair, these are really the only 2 things you need here, but I'm gonna go into a little bit of things. Plug in your distribute points on faces into your instance on points, and put your collection info as the instances for your instances on points. As you can see, it's really big. Change the number really small so that way you can see it. And now, as you can tell, they're overlapping. We don't want to overlap. Again, we tried to separate the kids. They don't want to separate. They just want to overlap and fucking live all cozy in their little fucking stacked house. I don't know what this is. Now, what you're going to need to do is pick instances. Essentially, what this will do is it'll randomize the placement of them. I don't know how to explain it fully. I don't understand. It's just like, instead of like each point, all of the geometry is going to stack on top of each other and overlay, but if you pick instance, it'll pick one of the geometries in the collection to place there. So this is one of the main reasons, and you can randomize this later and I'll show you. Next, we're going to add a random value. We're going to plug this into the rotation so that way it's not all facing the same way, and essentially we can just rotate it differently. The seed value will change a little bit. You don't really need to play with that. It's pretty random as it is. Next, we're going to add in another random value, and we're going to plug this into the scale. As you can see, it's really big, but this is really important. I actually really want these objects to be pretty big. I actually want them to overlap, but in scale, not like stacked on top of each other. And the reason why is because we don't really want to see what's underneath. We don't want to see that icosphere underneath. It's kind of like it's there if we need it, but you know, we hide in that bitch. Alright? Another thing you can do, which this isn't 100% necessary, and I didn't do this with my original version, but you can group your nodes. To do this, just select all the nodes you want to put into a little collection, essentially, and once they're all selected, make sure at least one of them is highlighted, so just shift click one of them, and then Control G. That'll put them into this little group that you see here, and if you click tab, you can enter it. And from here, we're going to plug in a bunch of the values that we want to play with afterwards. So this way, if you plug these all into the group input node, you'll notice that they come out here. So now these are just values that you can play with. You don't have to worry about it. This is sort of an introductory level to geometry nodes. We're not going into anything super crazy here. So if you guys want something crazy, let me know. We're gonna rename these so that way it's a little bit better later on. So essentially the first one was foliage density. We need the density seed, rotation random min, seed, scale random min, and all that stuff. So that way they're all named properly. Then we're going to reconnect these into the original group input node, and what that's going to do, it's going to actually put those values that those controllers that we wanted into our modifier stack. So now we don't even have to have geometry nodes open whatsoever. We can just look at our modifier stack and go onto our modifier settings and see all the controls that we have for that geometry node. Makes it a little bit more simple, and this way it's a little bit easier to play with. And if you append this to any other project, these things are there, essentially controllers set up, and they're renamed, perfectly ready for you to go. And if you start moving these, as you can see, if you were to animate these, you could do this. And here's a little weird thing, you know, maybe you want to do something like this. This is kind of something weird that happens if you change the origin point. The wing controller works on everything, so essentially this is why we set up everything. Now it looks like a little bush that has a little wave, and it's a little weird. It's cartoony, don't get me wrong. I don't think it's perfect, but if there's any other better ways, let me know. Now we're going to need to add some lights. This is one of the first steps that goes into shading for this whole tutorial. You're going to need 2 light sources to get like the Studio Ghibli look, and this is what I gathered from looking at the tutorial, which is right here and down in the description, obviously, because you probably can't click that. You really do want a highlight light because some of the shading involves having a highlight based light in your scene. Now we're going to go into shader editor, and we're going to keep the principal BSDF. The guy in the original video used a diffused node or a diffused shader and plugged that into the output, but we're going to use principal BSDF, and the reason why is because we need access to this normal layer here. And I'll show you why in a little bit, but first let's get started with the basic stuff for doing a toon shaded look, which is essentially what we're doing here. What you're going to need to do is at the end of your principal BSDF is you're going to plug in a shader to RGB, then plug in a color ramp, change it to constant, drag that value, and as you can see it's duotone, but we're going to bring that value all the way up. As you can see, because we had the highlight light up, it's already affecting correctly. This is why we set up the lights a little bit earlier. Now we're going to add a second value of a darker gray, and we're going to bring that up. This isn't 100% necessary. You can go straight to color if you really wanted to, but for now, to get your base values, this is a good way to go about it. Now you're going to want to bring your gray value all the way up to the point where you can't see the black anymore, because essentially what you're going to have is you're going to turn on ambient occlusion. What ambient occlusion is going to do is create little like streaks of black to separate your thing, and I personally think it looks a little bit better sometimes. Not all the time, depends on the look, but if you're going Studio Ghibli, this is the look you want to go for. So as you can see, I'm just playing around here, and we're gonna bring up another value of gray. You really only need this many, but to be fair, you can add in a shit ton. Doesn't matter whatsoever. Now, let's bring in an image from Studio Ghibli, a little reference image, and we're gonna pull that up. Essentially, all there is picking like each color and selecting it to figure out what highlights you want. You know, obviously, if you understand color values, you're gonna understand this a little bit better, but this is a good way if you want specific Studio Ghibli, like actually take a frame from Studio Ghibli and copy the colors. We're just adding, I'm still adjusting stuff, and this is really where you get to play around and actually choose the colors that you want. Now, the normal layer. We're gonna add a normal map. This is what's really important here, and something that I really want to explain that he didn't explain before. But because trees have leaves, I figured it's not gonna look perfect with just this toon shader look. It's gonna look too smooth. I wanna break up that sort of nice even gradient with some noise. So to do that with a toon shader is you're going to need to use your normal map. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to add a noise texture. Plug the the color into the normal map, and as you can see, it's all fucked up. But if you change it to like a value of 0.1, 0.2, max like 0.5, it'll look good. And as you can see, it's breaking up the gradient really nicely, and now you can start changing the values of the noise texture here and really play around with the detail and what you're really going for. It might even get you different looks that you never expected and you might have seen on here. Kind of look like a little snowy top for a second. Might want something like that, who knows. What's also nice is you can play with all these values in the principal BSDF, which all affect essentially the lighting that this gives off in the concentration, specular, roughness, metallic. The actual color of the object really affects like how much light is really affecting it. And as you can see, wind controller is affecting it. It's looking great. Now if you just start duplicating this around, doing it the way the other guy did, you'll get yourself a tree. But what's really cool about the fact that we use geonodes is that if you scale this up, it starts adding more and more geometry the more you scale it up. And this is in edit mode, so just be aware of that. You have to be in edit mode to do this. But now, this gives a little bit more variation. You could scale this up to be really big, or scale it to be whatever. Now, a little detail you can do if you want to control the noise values without going into the shader editor is just connect texture coordinates to noise texture. Add an empty object for the noise texture. Rename this to leave controller. Essentially, this is just leave noise controller. So probably rename it to something like that, and then select the new empty object. So now when you scale or move this around, it will add some variation. It'll change the scale of your noise and all that. And now, as you can see, everything's moving, and this is essentially what you'll end up with at the end of the video. Now, because this is the end of the video, as you can see, yeah, we can change the scale, we can do all this stuff. It's really good. And you can add subdivision if you want to make it like an actual like bulb. And then maybe even add displacement on top of that, so that way it's even more like a tree. But now that we're at the end of the tutorial, I wanted to put this to use. So here's a little quick time lapse of me making a scene using these Studio Ghibli trees and using some of the techniques that we learned in this tutorial for shading to create an entirely toon shaded environment. Not entirely Studio Ghibli, to be quite honest with you. It's not perfect. There's obviously a lot of work that needs to be done if you're really trying to replicate it, but because I'm always here to do things for my own sake, I really only wanted a toon shader. Studio Ghibli, that's clickbait. But it's a toon shader that sort of shares a resemblance to it. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I appreciate you guys watching. Enjoy this time lapse and a little bit of music. Peace.